There's no shortage of crime in the world, but fortunately, many criminals are convicted and sentenced for their wrongdoings. In most cases, their sentence is based on how extreme their crimes were. Despite there being a finite number of years in the average human lifespan, people guilty of especially horrible misdeeds are often given much longer sentences to reduce their chances of getting out on parole. Today, we'll be talking about the longest life sentences given to prisoners. Terry Lynn Nichols is an American domestic terrorist who is convicted of being an accomplice in the Oklahoma City bombing. Before his incarceration, he held a variety of short-term jobs, working as a farmer, grain elevator manager, real estate salesman, and ranch hand. He met his future co-conspirator Timothy McVeigh during a brief stint in the United States Army, which ended in 1989 when he requested a hardship discharge after less than 1 year of service. In 1994 and 1995, he conspired with McVeigh in the planning and preparation of the truck bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, on April 19, 1995. The bombing killed 168 people. In a federal trial in 1997, Nichols was convicted of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter for killing federal law enforcement personnel. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole after the jury deadlocked on the death penalty. He was also tried in Oklahoma on state charges of murder in connection with the bombing. In 2004, he was convicted of 161 counts of first-degree murder, including 1 count of fetal homicide, first-degree arson, and conspiracy. As in the federal trial, the state jury was deadlocked on imposing the death penalty. He was sentenced to 161 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole and is incarcerated at ADX Florence, a super-maximum security prison near Florence, Colorado. Chamoy Thipayaso is a former employee of the Petroleum Authority of Thailand. She is known for receiving the world's longest prison sentence of life imprisonment, or 141,078 years for her involvement in a pyramid scheme that defrauded more than 16,000 Thais and is estimated to have been worth between $200 million and $301 million. In the late 1960s, she started a chit fund called the Mae Chamoy Fund, which was made to look like an oil share with high returns. Through her connections with the Air Force and Petroleum Authority, the fund was able to sustain itself for a long period of time. Her connections to the military were a huge factor in political and business power, and the military backing made the scheme seem legitimate. The fund had a large number of politically powerful investors from the military and even the royal household, and as such there were calls for the government to bail out the banks and the chit funds. After discussions with King Bhumibol Adulyadej, the nature of which were not made public, the Mae Chamoy Fund was shut down, and Chamoy was arrested. She was held in secret by the Air Force for several days, and her trial was not held until after the losses for the military and royal personnel involved had been recovered. On July 27, 1989, she was sentenced to a total of 141,078 years or life imprisonment in prison for having committed corporate fraud, but Thai law at the time stated that the maximum sentence that could be served for fraud was 20 years. In actuality, she only served about 8 years of the sentence. A Colorado judge formally sentenced James Egan Holmes to multiple life terms plus thousands of years in prisons for the Aurora movie theater massacre that killed 12 and wounded 70. Holmes, a 27-year-old former grad student, received 1 life term for each person he killed, plus 3,318 years for the attempted murders of those he wounded and for rigging his apartment with explosives. He is not eligible for parole. It is the court's intention that the defendant never set foot in free society again, Judge Carlos A. Samore Jr. said after imposing the sentence Wednesday. If there was ever a case that warranted a maximum sentence, this is the case. The defendant does not deserve any sympathy. There was a smattering of applause as Holmes, shackled at the waist and wearing a red prison garb, was led away from the courtroom where he has spent most of his days since jury selection. Prosecutor George Brockler said he believed the sentence was the 4th longest in the U.S. history. He describes the judge's command to promptly remove Holmes from the courtroom as the right exclamation point to bring a painful, difficult trial to a close. Wearing a helmet, gas mask, and ballistic gear, Holmes tossed tear gas into Theater 9 of the Century 16 Megaplex in Aurora during the first minutes of the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises. Armed with a shotgun, rifle, and a pistol, he opened fire on July 20th, 2012. He had more than 700 rounds of ammo with him. After his gun jammed, Holmes walked out of the theater and surrendered. Martin Bryant murdered 35 people and injured a further 23 during a shooting spree in Port Arthur, Tasmania, back in April 1996. The incident was so brutal that it became known as the Port Arthur Massacre and led the Australian government to introduce extensive extra measures on firearms ownership. Bryant was sentenced to 35 life sentences and an additional 1,652 years with no possibility of parole, and he remains in Risdon Prison in Hobart. In the resurfaced video, taken from an Australian TV program about his crimes, Bryant is shown answering questions asked by police investigators, but briefly lets his guard down when he thinks that the tape is no longer recording. At that moment, he seems to admit to the killings freely, even chuckling while he does so. Bryant told the police officers, "I'm sure you'll find the person that caused all of this." He then points to himself and mutters, "Me," under his breath. One of the police officers then responds, "I don't find that a very funny statement at all, Martin, to be quite honest." The grinning Bryant then says, "You should have put that on recording." That's when the police officer confirms, "Oh, it's still recording at the present stage." Dudley Wayne Kaiser received 2 life sentences and 10,000 years in prison for the Halloween 1976 killings of 3 people in Tuscaloosa. Because the death penalty was not an option at the time of his trial, the jury recommended the unprecedented sentence to send a message to future parole boards that Kaiser, now 74, should never be let out of prison. The sentence was at one time in the Guinness Book of World Records as the longest in the world. Decades later, it remains one of the longest. Kaiser was convicted twice for shooting his estranged wife, Emily Diane Kaiser. He also killed his wife's mother, Eunice Barringer, who was the household at the Delta Tau Delta Fraternity House on the University of Alabama campus, and UA student Richard Pyron, the treasurer of the fraternity who had come to the house to help with yard work. According to Tuscaloosa News Archives, Kaiser went to his wife's home on 13th Street East. A neighbor told the news at the time that he walked around after hearing what sounded like firecrackers and saw Emily Kaiser lying in the driveway of a neighbor's home. She had been shot in the chest before trying to escape with her young son. She tried to speak to the neighbor before she died, but was unable. Her son continued running to another neighbor's home, not realizing that his mother had fallen in the gravel driveway. Police arrived and found Eunice Barringer and Richard Pyron dead in the house. Barringer had been shot in the forehead and Pyron had been shot in the shoulder and head. Kaiser, 35 at the time, was named as a suspect and arrested soon after. A jury sentenced Kaiser in 1977 to death by electric chair, but that conviction was overturned after Alabama's death penalty law was struck down. He retired in 1981 and was sentenced to 2 mandatory life sentences and a 10,000-year term. He has been denied parole 10 times during the 39 years he's been in prison. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Click on the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload new videos. We'll see you in the next one.